Have you ever returned home expecting the world to feel just right, only to find that everything has changed, and you're the last to know? My name is Elena Marsh, and if you've ever felt like the one quietly holding your family together, then this story might feel a little bit like yours. I always thought Christmas Eve would mean twinkling porch lights, the scent of cinnamon and pine, maybe a hug from my mom or a quiet cup of tea with my grandfather. Instead, that year my key slipped into the lock of a house that felt colder than the December air outside. No lights, no music, just the hush of a refrigerator humming behind a closed door, and my own breath fogging up the glass as I tried to convince myself I hadn't gotten the date wrong. There's something about holidays that magnifies every hope and every disappointment. We wait all year for those perfect moments, just a little warmth, a little laughter, the kind of togetherness you see in greeting card commercials. But the night I stepped into our dark kitchen, I found my grandfather Walter hunched over a dry sandwich, his shoulders drawn in like he was trying to disappear. He looked up when he heard me, his eyes kind, but tired, and for a second I felt like I was intruding on a secret I was never meant to discover. "You're here," he said softly, as though he'd been waiting for someone who never arrived. And in that moment I realized I wasn't just coming home. I was about to walk into the hardest lesson of my life. Sometimes the biggest betrayals aren't announced with shouting or slammed doors. They're whispered in the quiet choices people make when they think you won't notice. I found a note taped to the fridge, written in my mother's rushed handwriting, the kind she used for grocery lists and apologies she hoped I'd accept without question. "Used your savings to invest in stocks. We'll explain later. Watch Grandpa." That was it. $24,000, 4 years of canceled weekends, late-night double shifts and silent sacrifices had vanished in a single sentence. I stood there, the paper trembling in my hand, wondering how much of myself I'd given away in the name of family, and how much I had left to reclaim. If you've ever felt like you were carrying more than your share, you're not alone. In families, it's so easy to become the responsible one, the fixer, the steady hand, the safety net. No one thanks until it's gone. That night, as I made Grandpa Walter oatmeal with apples and honey, the way he used to make it for me, I realized I could spend my life waiting for others to see my worth, or I could decide to fight for it myself. This story isn't just about what was taken. It's about what you find when you finally stop waiting to be rescued and start rescuing yourself. Before we go further, let me ask you, have you ever sacrificed something for someone only to realize they never saw the cost? If you have, I hope you'll stay with me. Because the journey from feeling invisible to reclaiming your power isn't easy, but it's one that just might change everything. When I was 16, most kids I knew were counting down the days until they could drive or sneaking out to concerts on a Friday night. I was counting tips in the break room of a 24-hour diner, my shoes sticky from spilled coffee, and my hair always smelling faintly of onions. My family had always struggled with money. My dad's work at the auto shop was never steady, and my mom's shifts at the craft store were rarely enough to cover more than groceries and the light bill. So I did what seemed natural. I worked. After school weekends, even on holidays when the pay was better. Each dollar tucked away in my worn leather wallet felt like a promise, a small rebellion against the uncertainty that always seemed to linger in our kitchen. There's a certain pride that comes from building something out of nothing, even if that something is just a modest savings account at the corner credit union. I still remember the day I brought my mom the crisp folder with my account number inside. I was exhausted after my 6th weekend in a row without a break, but proud in a way I couldn't explain. She smiled and said, "Banks prey on young people. Just transfer it to our family account. I'll keep it safe until you need it." And I believed her because believing your parents want what's best for you feels like the safest place in the world. Month after month, I funneled every extra shift, every birthday tip, every scraped-together dollar into that safe place. I drove a car that rattled when I turned left, lived on ramen, and skipped movies with friends to pick up hospital shifts and babysitting jobs. My sister Mia was 6 years younger and lived in a different version of our house, one where birthdays meant new phones and summer camp not utility bills stacked on the counter. She never had to work or even ask what things cost. When I got the flu during finals, she was the one who got soup delivered to her room while I worked through the chills and hoped nobody would notice. Looking back, I can see how those little differences added up. Each sacrifice I made became invisible, expected, and soon enough, I wore the title of the strong one like armor. My mother's favorite phrase was, "We don't want to burden her," meaning my sister, of course. I told myself it didn't matter, that some people just carried more because they could. But that belief was a quiet ache I learned to ignore until that Christmas Eve when every choice I'd made seemed to add up to a single harsh truth: I was responsible for everyone, but no one felt responsible for me. Sometimes I wonder how many of us grow up thinking that love means putting yourself last. There's a line between helping your family and losing yourself for them, but it's so hard to see when you're inside it. I saw it everywhere: friends taking on second jobs to help their parents, cousins shelving their college dreams to keep the lights on at home. In the US, we like to believe everyone has a fair shot if they work hard enough, but no one talks about the weight some kids carry quietly behind closed doors. There's a reason why the responsible one in every family rarely asks for help. They've been taught that their worth is tied to their usefulness, not their happiness. One night in high school, my best friend Kayla stayed over. She was the only one who ever really saw the whole picture. We sat at my kitchen table while I balanced the checkbook, her eyes wide as she watched me subtract line by line. "Doesn't it ever make you angry?" she asked, glancing at the pile of bills. I shrugged, brushing it off. I guess it's just my role. But the truth is, it did hurt. I just didn't have a name for it yet. That's the thing about family dynamics: they don't become clear until you step back and see what's missing. When I lost my savings, it wasn't just the money that disappeared. It was years of believing that my efforts were seen, that my place in the family was more than just a safety net. The lesson hit hard. No matter how much you give, some people will always expect more, and they'll call it love. If you're someone who's ever felt invisible beneath the weight of expectation, I hope you'll hear this. You are not alone, and you are not selfish for wanting your sacrifices to matter. It's not wrong to hope that the people you care for will care for you in return. The real danger comes when you start believing that your only value is in what you can provide. I started to realize this slowly over years, and small disappointments when my birthday came and went, with little more than a text, when my sister needed help with homework, and my parents asked me to stay in on Friday night, when the family celebrated milestones I made possible but never got to enjoy. The warning signs were always there. I just wasn't ready to see them. The night I found my savings gone, I sat across from Grandpa Walter and felt the weight of every missed opportunity pressing in. But instead of breaking me, that moment became a turning point. I began to question the boundaries I'd never set, the patterns I'd never challenged. I realized that if I didn't protect what I had left: my time, my energy, my future, no one else would. Here's a lesson I wish I'd learned sooner. Sometimes the hardest part of growing up isn't providing for your family. It's learning where you end and they begin. Drawing that line is the first step towards something better, even if it means starting over from scratch. As Grandpa finished his oatmeal that night, I looked at him. Really looked and saw not just his frailty, but his quiet gratitude. I promised myself and him that I wouldn't let us disappear beneath someone else's plans again. I started making a list right there at the kitchen table of what needed to change. Because the only thing harder than losing everything is realizing you never truly had a place to begin with. And so, as the snow tapped softly against the window and the house settled into an uneasy silence, I opened my laptop and began to trace every dollar, every promise, every lie. The road back wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in a long time, I felt something like hope, thin and tentative, but real. Next, I would discover just how much had been taken not just from me, but from Grandpa too, and with every new truth, the urge to protect what remained would only grow stronger. That first morning after the world tipped sideways, I woke to the sound of Grandpa Walter coughing in the next room. The sound was dry, persistent, almost apologetic, as if even his lungs didn't want to cause a fuss. I wrapped myself in an old blanket and tiptoed into the kitchen. There he was bracing himself against the counter, hands trembling as he tried to pour a glass of water. The winter light through the window painted shadows across his face, and for the first time I saw how thin he'd gotten. I gently took the glass from him, guiding him back to the table, and asked if he'd taken his morning medicine. He shook his head, eyes sliding away. I ran out 2 days ago. I asked Mia to pick them up, but she said she was busy. There was a quiet shame in his voice, and it struck me how rarely we notice when the strongest among us start to falter. I searched the usual places above the stove and the worn pill organizer behind the coffee tins. Nothing but a single expired bottle and a pharmacy slip, the pickup date circled in bright pink. I glanced at the fridge, 2 yogurts long, past their prime, a jar of pickles, and a single wrinkled apple in the fruit bowl. The bread had gone stale. The sink overflowed with dishes. "What have you eaten besides sandwiches?" I asked, keeping my voice light. Grandpa's gaze drifted toward the floor. "Haven't managed much else this week." That was the first moment I realized how far things had slipped. The house once full of the hum of life and laughter felt hollow now, a shell left behind by people too busy chasing their own comfort to notice what was being lost. I started snapping pictures almost on autopilot. The empty pillbox, the overdue utility bill peeking out from under the toaster, the note from my mom still taped to the fridge, her hurried script now feeling like an accusation instead of an apology. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe this was just what happened when families grew apart and everyone got busy. But then I remembered something I'd read a few years back in the United States. Nearly 1 in 10 seniors experiences some form of neglect, often from those they trust most. Sometimes it's a stranger or a caregiver. More often it's the family blind to the slow fade of responsibility, making small excuses that pile up until someone falls through the cracks. That knowledge weighed on me sharper than anger. I thought back to when I was little, when Grandpa would walk me home from school and slip butterscotch candies into my mittened hands. He was always steady, always there. Now, when he needed help most, the people who should have cared for him were nowhere to be found. I remembered the last family group text, a flurry of messages about vacation deals and travel points, not a word about who'd stop by to check on Grandpa. It was easier to plan a trip to Maui than pick up a $10 prescription at the corner pharmacy. I wanted to believe there was some misunderstanding that if I reached out, someone would offer a reasonable explanation. But every sign pointed to the same truth my family was good at saying, "We'll take care of it," not so good at the taking care part. In moments like these, it's tempting to step into the role of silent fixer to patch every leak before anyone else notices the floor is wet. It's what I'd done my whole life. But I was starting to see where that path led, not to gratitude or recognition, but to a quiet kind of erasure. I called the pharmacy, hoping there'd been some mistake. The tech on the other end of the line recognized my grandfather's name and confirmed the medication was still waiting. "Someone tried to pick it up with the wrong ID," she added. "We couldn't release it." That's when the frustration in my chest turned into resolve. Neglect doesn't always look like a bruised arm or an empty fridge. Sometimes it's forgetting to make a call, skipping a chore, trusting that someone else will handle the hard parts. But when it comes to people you love, someone else can't be the answer. After Grandpa dozed off in his recliner, I sat down at the kitchen table and started making lists. What did he need right now just to get through the week? What appointments had he missed? What bills were past due? I called his doctor, scheduled a check-in, and set reminders on my phone for medication refills. I looked up meal delivery services for seniors and signed him up for the local Meals on Wheels, remembering how he used to tell me independence is a gift you can lose in a single winter. I didn't want to take over his life. I just wanted to make sure he could keep living it. There was a quiet sense of accomplishment in these small steps, but also a heavy sadness. I knew that in another world, my mom or Mia could have done these things. They might have once. But sometimes the roles we grow up with are hard to break, and people get comfortable letting someone else do the heavy lifting. I thought of other families I knew, friends who sent money home every month, but never got a call back, neighbors who cared for aging parents alone, while siblings lived hours away and rarely visited. Maybe it's an American thing, this idea that everyone should be able to handle things on their own, even when they can't. Or maybe it's just human nature to look away from what makes us uncomfortable. Here's the lesson I began to learn. It's easy to let small neglect slide to say next week, or someone else will do it. But kindness isn't a one-time act. It's a habit, a practice you choose every day, even when you're tired, even when no one is watching. When you start letting the little things slip, it's only a matter of time before the big things fall apart. Families aren't built on grand gestures. They're held together by 1,000 small acts of showing up. By the time the sun was high, Grandpa was sleeping soundly in his chair. The lines of worry on his face softened for the first time in days. I looked around at the half-tidy kitchen, the fresh groceries on the counter, and felt a flicker of hope. Maybe I couldn't fix everything, but I could change how things went from here. I glanced at the folder of bank statements I'd started compiling the evidence of all that had been taken not just from me, but from Grandpa too. If I wanted to protect what little we had left, I'd have to step into a role I never asked for, not just the fixer, but the protector. And as I pulled up my laptop to document every transaction, every forgotten errand, every broken promise, I knew the real work was only beginning. Because the more I looked, the clearer it became. The problem wasn't just a missing prescription or a lost savings account. It was a pattern, one that needed to be broken before it broke us for good. And in the days ahead, as I uncovered just how deep the cracks ran, I would have to decide where I stood and what I was willing to do to set things right. The first time I logged into my online banking account that week, my hands were shaking. I told myself it was just nerves, that maybe there was some mistake, a transfer gone wrong, a bill paid twice, something easy to untangle if I just looked close enough. But the further I scrolled, the more the story wrote itself. Small withdrawals, at first labeled grocery run or family emergency, a couple hundred here and there, the kind of amounts you can ignore if you're not paying attention. But then came the larger ones: investment opportunity, flight confirmation, medical advance. The pattern was unmistakable. Each entry was a pinprick, and by the end, it felt like I'd been drained dry by 1,000 cuts. I started printing everything, pages and pages of statements, each transaction a breadcrumb leading back to someone I loved. I made piles, what I knew for certain, what I needed to check, what didn't make sense. My mind buzzed with questions. Had my mom always meant to pay me back? Had Mia realized how much she was taking? Did my dad ever wonder if there was a line that shouldn't be crossed? It was strange how easy it was to feel both furious and guilty at once, to love people and feel betrayed by them in the same breath. The more I saw, the clearer it became that I hadn't just lost money, I'd lost my place in the story of my own family. It reminded me of the time I organized a surprise party for Mia's 16th birthday, pooling every spare dollar from my after-school jobs to buy decorations and a cake with her name in pink icing. I did it because I loved her, because I wanted her to feel special, even when I was too tired to join the celebration myself. That day, Mom hugged me and said, "You're the glue that keeps us together." It was meant as a compliment, but now, all these years later, it sounded like a warning. The thing about being the glue is that it's a silent job. You're always there, patching up the cracks, holding things in place. But when people lean on you too hard, you start to wear thin. It's a pattern I've seen in so many American families. Eldest daughters or responsible sons expected to hold everything together, their efforts fading into the background while everyone else moves on. It's easy to mistake love for obligation, and easier still to believe that if you just try a little harder, you can make things right. But sometimes the more you give, the more people take, until you realize you've given away more than you ever meant to lose. As I dug deeper, I began to see that my family's actions weren't born from malice. They were the result of years of small choices, putting off difficult conversations, assuming someone else would step in, telling themselves that everything was fine, because no one had said otherwise. Maybe they thought I was strong enough to handle it. Maybe they believed I'd understand. But the truth is, when everyone believes the responsible one will save the day, no one else learns how to care. One evening, while I was sorting papers at the kitchen table, Grandpa came and sat beside me. He didn't say much, just patted my hand and offered a butterscotch from his ever-present stash. It was a small gesture, but it broke something open inside me. I realized that being strong doesn't mean never needing help. Sometimes it means asking for it, even demanding it when the people around you forget how much you're carrying. That night, I made a promise to myself I would not let their silence become my story. If no one else would step up, I would, but I would do it on my terms. Real-life stories like mine play out in countless households across the country. A friend of mine, Julia, once confided in me that she put her college plans on hold to care for her grandmother, only to watch her siblings move out, chasing new jobs and lives. I kept thinking if I just held on a little longer, they'd see what I was doing and come back, she told me. But they never did. It's a common mistake believing that sacrifice alone will change the people around us. The lesson I wish more of us learned: boundaries are as much a part of love as generosity is. In the weeks that followed, I began to change how I thought about family. I stopped waiting for apologies that might never come and instead focused on the practical steps I could take to protect myself and Grandpa. I canceled old joint accounts, set up new ones in just our names, and documented every dollar spent or saved. I stopped trying to justify other people's choices and started asking myself what I needed to feel safe. It wasn't easy. Nothing about loving people deeply ever is. But each step was a way of reclaiming not just my money, but my sense of self. Here's a gentle lesson from all those late nights and early mornings. Love without boundaries isn't love. It's a slow erasure of who you are. It's okay to say no, to demand fairness, to ask for help. It's not selfish to want your sacrifices to matter, and it's not wrong to expect the people who lean on you to learn how to stand on their own. We teach people how to treat us not with speeches or scolding, but by the lines we draw and the limits we honor. As the days grew longer and the holidays faded, I found a strange sense of relief settling in. The truth was out in the open. There would be no more hiding, no more waiting for someone else to fix what had broken. I was no longer just the glue. I was rebuilding something new, something sturdier for myself and for Grandpa Walter. The next challenge would be harder still, confronting the family I'd always tried to protect and letting them see not just what they'd taken, but what I was no longer willing to give. For the first time, I felt ready to speak for myself, to say the things I'd always tucked away out of fear or loyalty. And as I closed my laptop and turned off the kitchen light that night, I knew the conversation was coming. I wasn't sure what it would bring, but I knew one thing for certain: silence was no longer an option. The following morning, the air in the house felt different. It wasn't lighter exactly, but it was sharper, clearer, like a breeze blowing away the fog. I stood at the window with my coffee, watching frost shimmer on the grass, and I knew it was time to stop replaying the past and start taking action. Grandpa Walter needed more than comfort. He needed security, consistency, and a plan. And I realized, so did I. My first step was reaching out to someone who would understand both the emotional tangle and the legal necessities: my friend Nina. Nina and I had met in college, bonding over midnight study sessions, and our shared sense that doing the right thing sometimes left you lonelier than you'd expected. Nina had become a paralegal at a small Boston firm. When I explained what had happened, her response was brisk, practical, but never cold. You need to get power of attorney for Grandpa medical and financial. You need to close joint accounts, reroute his checks, and start documenting everything. Her advice was direct, rooted in experience, but she ended every email with, "You're not wrong for feeling hurt. Take care of you, too." Legal paperwork had always seemed intimidating to me, a foreign language I'd never needed to learn. But sitting with Grandpa at the dining table, reading every line of the power of attorney forms, I realized that these steps weren't just bureaucracy. They were declarations. From now on, I would be the one protecting him. We took a slow walk to the notary at the local pharmacy, where Grandpa signed with a steady hand. "We should have done this a year ago," he said, squeezing my palm. In that small moment, I felt both the burden and the honor of responsibility, knowing I was stepping up, not just because I had to, but because I wanted to. After the paperwork was done, I shifted my attention to Grandpa's daily life. I researched local services for seniors and found a Meals on Wheels program in our county. Within days, a friendly volunteer was dropping off warm lunches at our door. I set up pill reminders on his phone and organized his medications by day and time. We made the kitchen safer too, moving the heavier pans lower, swapping out the old rug that liked to bunch up underfoot. Each adjustment, though small, was a way to restore a sense of safety and dignity for Grandpa. It struck me as we went about these changes how easy it is to overlook the basics when you're overwhelmed. I remembered stories from friends, one who only realized her grandmother hadn't eaten a proper meal in weeks. When she visited unexpectedly, another who found overdue bills tucked in drawers because her aging uncle was too proud to ask for help. In America, where independence is so highly valued, it's sometimes hard to know when to step in. But dignity doesn't mean doing everything alone. It means having choices and support, and a home that feels safe. With Grandpa's immediate needs addressed, I turned back to the financial mess. I opened a new checking account in both our names, making sure his Social Security payments and pension would land somewhere safe. I started a damage control folder on my laptop, screenshots, receipts, letters, every shred of evidence that told the story of what had happened. Each document was more than proof. It was a record of the boundaries I was learning to set. I realized then that protecting your future is not an act of rebellion. It's an act of self-respect. A quiet lesson emerged from those days. Real love is practical. It's not just words or memories. It's groceries delivered, prescriptions, filled light bulbs replaced, and boundaries enforced. I could forgive my family for not understanding this yet, but I couldn't wait for them to catch up. The longer you delay drawing lines, the more painful it becomes when they're finally crossed. Still, there were moments I felt the old guilt creep in. Was I being too harsh by shutting out my mother and Mia? Was I giving up on them too soon? But every time I looked at Grandpa eating a hot meal, finally sleeping through the night, I was reminded that my first loyalty was to those who showed up, not those who just made promises. Sometimes doing the right thing means letting go of the people who aren't ready to do it with you. In the evenings, Grandpa and I developed new routines. We played cards at the kitchen table, sharing quiet laughter over hands of gin rummy. I started reading to him again, as he'd once read to me. The old fear, the worry that I'd lose myself to responsibility began to fade. In its place grew something steadier, the realization that I could care for someone without being consumed, that boundaries weren't just lines to keep people out, but lines to keep myself safe within. I knew the hardest part still lay ahead. My family would come home soon expecting everything to be as it was. They would want explanations, maybe even forgiveness, but I wasn't the same person they'd left behind. I'd learned how to fight for what mattered, and how to refuse what didn't. The next step would require courage to speak the truth out loud face to face, and ask the people I loved to see me, not just as the fixer, but as someone who deserved care too. As I turned off the lights and settled into bed that night, I felt a new kind of tiredness. Not the exhaustion of being stretched thin, but the honest fatigue of real work done with love. I knew tomorrow would bring new challenges, but I also knew I'd wake up ready. Because for the first time in years, I was fighting for something that belonged to me, a life where both Grandpa and I were seen valued and finally safe. It was a Sunday afternoon when I saw the first photo. I'd just finished sorting Grandpa's medication and was scrolling through my phone, trying to distract myself from the weight of paperwork piled on the kitchen counter. There it was, my mother standing on a sun-drenched balcony, cocktail in hand, beaming at the camera. Dad's arm draped loosely around her shoulders, sunglasses hiding any hint of guilt. The caption read, "Finding Peace in Paradise." We deserve this. It stung not because of the destination, but because I recognized the dress, new, bright, expensive, the sort she'd always said was for special occasions only. Apparently, Christmas Eve with her own father didn't make the cut. I clicked through more photos, each one twisting the knife a little deeper. Mia posted stories from the pool, smiling with friends whose names I barely recognized, hashtagging blessed and making memories. There was no mention of Grandpa, no mention of me. Just sunset cruises, spa days, and meals that cost more than a week's worth of groceries back home. The gap between their world and mine had never looked wider. For years, I'd measured love in hours worked and sacrifices made. But to them, love was a story you told online, a string of shiny moments carefully chosen and filtered. It's a strange feeling realizing the future you were building for yourself was traded away for someone else's vacation. I remembered every shift I'd picked up, every night I'd spent studying, instead of sleeping all, to save for a degree, a better apartment, maybe a small patch of freedom in a world that so often felt tight around the edges. I thought of friends who'd been through similar betrayals. Jess, who paid off her family's debts, only to find herself left out of the very home she helped save. Mark, whose parents sold his childhood car to buy a camper for themselves. These stories were everywhere, little secrets people carried, because they were too ashamed to speak them out loud. I tried to imagine what my mother would say if I confronted her. "We did it for the family, maybe," or "you'll understand when you're older." It was always the same script. There's a certain way some families talk about sacrifice, like it's a river that only flows one way. The older I got, the more I realized that love shouldn't come with a receipt, and that helping the people you care about shouldn't mean losing yourself in the process. It's tempting in moments like these to let resentment take root. I felt it sharp and bitter curling behind my ribs every time I looked at their photos. But as I washed the dishes and reheated soup for Grandpa, I remembered something he'd once told me as a child. People will show you who they are by what they choose when they think you're not looking. His words echoed in the empty kitchen, reminding me that while I couldn't control what my family did, I could control how I responded. So I leaned into the ordinary, steady things that built real love. I cooked meals with Grandpa, listened to his stories, called the pharmacy when the refill didn't arrive. I found comfort in routines, quiet moments of laughter, hands of cards played at dusk grocery runs where I let Grandpa choose the apples himself. The life we built wasn't glamorous, but it was real. And in those small moments, I realized I wasn't missing out. I was making something better, something honest. The lesson I learned was simple, but it changed everything. Happiness isn't something you buy on vacation. It's built slowly from the choices you make every day. Money can make life easier, but it can't make people kinder. All the sunset cruises in the world can't replace the feeling of being seen, valued, and loved for who you are, not what you provide. I also learned that boundaries are an act of love too. By protecting what remained of Grandpa's independence and my own sense of self, I was honoring the years he'd spent caring for me. I began to see that drawing lines wasn't about shutting people out, but about making space for the relationships that mattered most, the ones where kindness and respect flowed both ways. Still, I won't pretend it was easy. There were nights I lay awake, replaying old memories, wondering if I was being too harsh, or if I should reach out and try to fix things yet again. But every morning when I saw Grandpa's smile as he found breakfast ready, I was reminded that some things can't be measured by what we lose, only by what we choose to protect. I knew, though, that the time for difficult conversations was coming. My family would be home soon, and the version of me they expected, quiet, compliant, endlessly forgiving, was gone. I had proof of every withdrawal, every missed call, every broken promise. For once, I was ready to tell the truth, not just to them, but to myself. As the sun set on another quiet Sunday, I sat with Grandpa on the porch, a blanket over our knees, and the air sharp with the promise of winter. "They're coming home soon," I said softly. He nodded, understanding more than I could say. "Let them," he replied. "We'll be here." And with those words, I felt the ground steady beneath my feet. I was no longer waiting for someone else's approval or grieving what had been taken. I was ready at last to reclaim what was left and to build a life that couldn't be stolen away. The day my family returned from their trip, the weather was as gray and uncertain as my mood. I watched their car pull up the drive from the living room window, my hands clasped tightly together, heart beating fast, but not from fear. Not this time. I'd prepared for this moment, folders stacked on the coffee table, emails printed and arranged, every receipt and transfer highlighted ready. Grandpa was in his favorite chair, quietly supportive, the steady anchor I'd needed all along. When the front door opened, my parents swept in, their voices echoing through the hallway, loud, cheerful, almost determinedly so. But the moment they saw me and the thick packet in my lap, their expressions flickered with unease. Mom dropped her bag with a sigh. "You could have called, you know." Dad set his suitcase down harder than necessary. "We heard from the bank." "What's going on, Elena?" It was strange seeing the defensiveness in their faces, the walls going up before I'd said a word. I took a breath and handed them the printouts, my voice steady as I explained what I'd found: the money, the transactions, the missed bills, and Grandpa's empty fridge. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse. I simply laid the facts bare. For a long time, no one spoke. Mom scanned the pages, her brow furrowing her mouth a thin line. Dad began pacing, muttering about timing and unexpected losses. When he finally spoke, it was the old family script. "We did it for us. For all of us. It was an investment. No one thought the market would crash. You're making this bigger than it is." Mia, who trailed in behind them, looked down, shame and anger warring in her eyes. For a moment, I almost caved, almost fell back into that old role, the peacemaker, the fixer. But I stayed quiet, letting the silence say what words never could. I remembered a story Nina once told me about a client who'd drained her daughter's college fund and justified it as a family emergency. The daughter forgave her, but their relationship was never the same. Trust is like glass, Nina said. You can glue it back together, but the cracks always show. That lesson stayed with me as I looked at my parents, not with anger, but with the clarity of someone who finally knew her own worth. I can't change what's been done, I told them. But I can change what comes next. Setting boundaries with family is one of the hardest things you'll ever do. In American culture, loyalty is celebrated, and speaking out against those who raised you is often painted as betrayal. But I'd learned slowly, painfully, that protecting yourself isn't a crime. It's an act of love, even if the people you love can't see it yet. I explained quietly but firmly that Grandpa's finances were now protected, that I'd set up legal safeguards, and that the money they'd taken would need to be paid back slowly over time with clear terms. It wasn't about revenge, it was about responsibility. Dad's anger gave way to disbelief. You'd really do this to your own parents? Mom's eyes filled with tears. After everything we've done for you, I felt those words like a familiar ache, but this time they didn't break me. After everything I've done for you, I replied gently, this is what's fair. We all have to live with our choices. For a moment, I saw something shift in Mia's face, a flicker of understanding, maybe even respect. She left the room without a word, but I knew she'd heard me. Grandpa, silent until now, cleared his throat. Elena's not taking anything from you. She's giving us a chance to do better. His voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of decades, the wisdom of someone who'd seen enough regret to know its cost. There was nothing left to argue. My parents stood in the living room like guests in a house that no longer belonged to them, uncertainty settling on their shoulders. Later that night, when the house had quieted, Mia slipped into the kitchen where I was making tea. She didn't apologize, not in so many words, but she hugged me tightly, a rare moment of sisterhood in the midst of so much chaos. I don't know if I could have done what you did, she whispered. I squeezed her hand. You might someday, or maybe you'll never have to. We both knew there was no perfect ending, but there could still be a new beginning. The lesson I realized was that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stop protecting people from the consequences of their actions. Sometimes love means letting others carry their share of the weight. I wasn't the same person they'd left behind before their trip, and our family would never go back to the way things were. But for the first time, I felt like the ground beneath my feet was my own. As I turned out the lights and headed to bed, I looked in on Grandpa sleeping peacefully and let myself hope for the future. There would be difficult days ahead, awkward conversations and wounds that might never fully heal. But there would also be freedom, the kind that comes from living honestly and loving yourself enough to say enough. The next chapter would bring more changes. Grandpa and I were making plans for something new, a life where trust was rebuilt day by day, not assumed or demanded. And I knew deep down that whatever happened next, we'd face it together. It didn't happen overnight, but in the days that followed our confrontation, the house settled into a quieter rhythm. My parents didn't speak much to me, and Mia mostly kept to herself, lost in her headphones, or long walks outside. There was no dramatic shouting, no door slamming, just a silent acknowledgement that the rules had changed. Every so often I'd catch my mother watching Grandpa from the hallway, her face uncertain. Maybe she saw for the first time how fragile he'd become, or maybe she was finally forced to notice what she'd chosen not to see for so long. One morning, as I was finishing breakfast dishes, my phone rang. The caller ID flashed Dad's name. I hesitated before answering, bracing myself for another round of accusations or justifications. But his voice was different this time, tired, almost defeated. Elena, he said, the market dropped. We lost almost everything. For a moment, I felt a twinge of sympathy remembering all the times I'd seen him try and fail to get ahead. But I kept my voice steady. You lost my trust before you lost the money, I said quietly. He tried to explain to appeal to the old script of doing it for the family, but I stood firm. You knew that money wasn't yours, I reminded him. There was a long silence on the line before he spoke again, asking, almost begging, for a loan to get them through the next month. It would have been easy to slip back into old habits to play the savior one more time. But I knew if I did, nothing would change. I can't help you this time, I told him. Not until you make things right. I hung up before guilt could change my mind. Later that night, I sat at the kitchen table and wrote out a repayment plan, clear fare with fixed amounts and deadlines. I enclosed copies of every account statement, the power of attorney document, and a short letter outlining my expectations. No more secrets, no more blurred boundaries. The next morning, I drove across town and taped the manila envelope to my parents' front door. It felt cold, almost transactional. But sometimes the only way to rebuild trust is to treat it like something valuable, because it is. That week, I found myself thinking about all the other families I'd known who'd navigated similar storms. My friend Leo had once confided in me that he stopped bailing out his brother after a decade of unpaid loans. It hurt at first, Leo told me, but it was the only way he ever learned to stand on his own. In a culture that values unconditional support, we rarely talk about the damage that can come from never saying no. Sometimes love means letting people wrestle with their own mistakes even when every instinct screams to shield them. I saw the results almost immediately. My parents didn't call again, but my mother sent a short text. "What is this about? We need to talk." I didn't answer. I spent the next day focused on Grandpa scheduling a home visit with his new physician, confirming his spot at the assisted living center near my apartment. We watched the virtual tour together, Grandpa nodding in approval at the sunlit windows and small garden. "Looks peaceful," he said softly. It was the first time in months I'd seen him truly relax. In the evenings, as I packed Grandpa's things for his upcoming move, I thought about the lessons hidden in all this pain. We're taught to forgive endlessly, to put family above all else. But forgiveness without accountability is just permission for history to repeat itself. By drawing a line, I wasn't just protecting myself, I was giving my parents a chance to change if they chose to take it. The move itself was bittersweet. Grandpa's new room was smaller, but it was bright and full of little comforts. A soft recliner, a shelf for his crossword puzzles, a photo of Grandma by the bed. The staff greeted him by name, and within days, he knew everyone's story, offering his familiar warmth in a new place. I visited every other day sometimes with groceries, sometimes just to sit and listen as he told stories from his youth. "You remind me of her," he'd say, and I'd know he meant Grandma, the one who taught him that kindness and strength could live side by side. A small but important lesson began to take root. Responsibility is not the same as control. I could protect Grandpa Advocate for myself and still leave room for my family to make their own choices, even if those choices led them further away. You can love someone and still let them go. One afternoon as I was leaving Grandpa's new home, a staff member stopped me. "He speaks so proudly of you," she said. "He always says you saved him." I smiled, but what I felt most was relief. I hadn't saved anyone. I'd simply learned to stop losing myself in the process of caring, and maybe that was enough. Back in my own apartment, as I sorted through the last of the paperwork, I let myself breathe for the first time in months. There would still be bills to pay, difficult conversations to navigate, and wounds that healed slowly. But there was also peace, the quiet certainty that I'd done the right thing even when it hurt. The hardest part of all, I realized, wasn't confronting my family. It was accepting that I couldn't control their choices, only my own. As spring edged closer and the days grew longer, I found comfort in the routines Grandpa and I had built: Saturday phone calls, Sunday, crossword puzzles, weekday walks in the garden. Our family might look different now, smaller, quieter, but it was real. It was enough. What came next would be another challenge, a new beginning. But I was ready, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel alone. With Grandpa settled into his new home life, found a gentler rhythm. The first few mornings in my quiet apartment felt strangely unfamiliar. No shuffling slippers in the hallway, no soft voice asking about breakfast. For the first time in years, my time was truly my own. At first, I wasn't sure what to do with all that space. I'd spent so long living on edge solving problems before anyone else noticed they'd begun. Now each day started with small choices, fresh coffee brewed just for me, walks in the early sun, the decision to spend a few extra minutes in silence before work. Little by little, I learned to breathe again. Grandpa was thriving in his new environment. He made friends quickly, people who shared his love of crosswords and old country songs. The staff at the assisted living center told me he always had a kind word, a joke, or a story to share. Each time I visited, I saw a new photo pinned to his bulletin board or found him deep in conversation by the garden windows. The guilt I'd worried would cling to me slowly faded, replaced by a quiet pride. I'd made the right choice, not just for him, but for myself. Rebuilding my own life wasn't as simple as unpacking boxes or starting a new routine. The old wounds lingered, the ache of betrayal, the sting of words I wished had been kinder, the emptiness left by family members who still hadn't called. Some nights I found myself staring at my phone, debating whether to send a text or wait for one that might never come. It's a strange thing the way family ties can feel like both a lifeline and a chain. But each day the distance hurt a little less. Each day I reclaimed a piece of myself I'd forgotten I'd lost. One step I took was meeting with a financial advisor, a small, nervous leap toward a future I could trust. I opened a new savings account this time with only my name on it. I set up automatic transfers, even if they were only small amounts. Each deposit felt like a promise, a step toward rebuilding what had been lost. I started reading about budgeting, investing, and financial boundaries skills I wished I'd learned sooner but was grateful to master now. I even joined a support group for adult children of financially irresponsible parents, finding comfort in stories that mirrored my own. A real-life example that stayed with me was the story of Hannah, a woman from the group who had spent a decade paying off her parents' credit cards. When she finally stopped, they were forced to downsize, but for the first time she could afford her own home. It felt selfish at first, she admitted, but I realized I was saving both of us from a cycle that would never end. Her story echoed mine, the realization that helping someone doesn't always mean saying yes, and that healthy boundaries are a gift to both sides. I made it a point to keep my world small but meaningful. I volunteered once a week at the local library, joined a book club, and took up painting, something I hadn't done since high school. With every new chapter, I gave myself permission to start over. The past would always be part of my story, but it didn't have to define my future. And in those quiet evenings with Grandpa's laughter drifting through the phone or a friend's message lighting up my screen, I found the kind of contentment I'd never known when I was always striving, always rescuing. The lesson I learned and keep learning is that you can't rebuild on the same shaky ground. Healing requires new foundations, trust earned, not assumed, love shown, not just spoken, and forgiveness not as a favor to others, but as a kindness to yourself. I realized that moving forward didn't mean forgetting what had happened, but allowing myself to grow beyond it. Still, there were moments of grief, birthdays and holidays that felt emptier than before, phone calls that ended too soon or never began. Sometimes I'd see a family laughing together at the park and feel a pang of longing, but more often I found myself grateful for the freedom to make my own choices, for the strength to set limits, for the quiet joy of a life that was finally truly my own. As spring settled in, I started planning small adventures, a day trip to the coast with Grandpa, a weekend visit from Nina, even a solo movie night just because I wanted to. Each event, no matter how simple, was a celebration of the life I was rebuilding, one grounded not in obligation or guilt, but in real connection and choice. What surprised me most was how the world opened up once I stopped trying to control every outcome. Opportunities found their way to me, a new job offer, unexpected friendships, even the slow mending of my relationship with Mia. She started calling more often, asking about Grandpa, sharing bits of her life. We never spoke much about the past, but in our shared silences, I sensed an understanding growing between us. Maybe this too was healing, less about perfect closure, more about steady, imperfect presence. Looking back, I saw how far I'd come and how each hard lesson had shaped me. The losses hurt, but the gains, self-respect, peace, the ability to stand on my own, were worth every step. And as I watched the sunset behind the city skyline, phone pressed to my ear, and Grandpa's voice telling me a joke I'd heard a dozen times before I knew I was no longer patching up old cracks. I was building something new. The final piece of the journey was ahead, one last look back, and a promise for the future. For the first time, I felt ready to say goodbye to what had been, and welcome what was coming next. On a quiet Saturday morning, I took a walk past my old family home. The grass was overgrown now, a faded for sale sign tilting in the yard, the porch paint flaking in the sun. I paused for a moment, memories swirling, late-night card games, birthday cakes, quiet worries tucked behind closed doors. Some houses, I realized, aren't really homes. Some are just places where lessons are learned the hard way. I didn't feel bitter, just quietly grateful for the distance, for the new life I'd fought to build. In these months since everything changed, I've come to understand what real love and family mean. It isn't measured in dollars saved or vacations taken, but in the steady kindness of someone who shows up time and time again. I learned that being the responsible one doesn't mean giving endlessly until you disappear. It means honoring your own boundaries, protecting what's left, and sometimes bravely walking away from old patterns that no longer serve you. Looking back, every chapter of this story held its own lesson. I learned to see the difference between sacrifice and self-betrayal. I learned that forgiveness requires accountability and that it's never too late to start again, even from zero. I discovered that real happiness is built not from grand gestures or family expectations, but from the small daily choices that honor both yourself and the people you love. Most of all, I realized that the only life worth building is one where your worth isn't determined by what you give up, but by what you choose to hold on to. If my story sounds familiar, if you've ever been the one holding everything together, or the one who quietly picks up the pieces, please know you're not alone. So many of us have been taught that love is selfless, that family means sacrifice without end. But I hope after hearing my journey you'll remember, this boundaries are love too. You deserve peace, respect, and a home, whether that's built with family or found along the way. As I settle into my new routines, weekly visits with Grandpa painting classes, slow mornings filled with hope, I feel lighter than I have in years. There are still tough days, but there is also laughter possibility and a future I get to shape. My family may look different now, but it's honest and it's enough. Before you go, I want to hear from you. Have you ever had to start over, set new boundaries, rebuild trust, or choose yourself after years of being the fixer? Share your story in the comments. Let's create a space where honesty and healing are celebrated, where nobody has to carry it all alone. If this story resonated with you, if you found comfort, hope, or a little courage, please subscribe, and join our growing community. Every comment, every story shared helps remind someone else that they too are worthy of love and respect. Because sometimes the most powerful family you'll ever know is the one you choose to build one honest story at a time. Thank you for watching, and remember, your voice matters here. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and share this video if it touched your heart. Until next time, take care, and never let anyone tell you that your worth depends on how much you can carry alone.